Hello everybody, I'm Jake from Jams and Tea, and today I'm coming at you with a brand new discography ranked video. This time around it's a bit of a timely one, seeing as one of this podcast's favorite musicians, prog legend Steven Wilson, is gearing up to release his new album, the Harmony Codex, at the end of this month. I figured it was high time that I take a crack at covering his solo albums, since we've covered most of our bases when it comes to his work in Porcupine Tree. Since 2009, Steven has 7 core studio albums released under his name, and as time has gone on, these records have garnered a similar level of respect and acclaim and even popularity as his work with Porcupine Tree, No Man, or any other of the half-dozen side projects he's maintained over the years. While there is decent overlap between some of these releases and his other works, his solo stuff has proved to be some of his most interesting and divergent material. So today I'll do my best to summarize this subsection of music in both an attempt to evaluate each of these records' quality and significance, as well as give you an idea as to where you might want to start if you want to begin exploring, if you're new or just relatively unfamiliar with these albums. So, without further ado.
Noise-canceling headphones. Self-esteem.
Well, we all have to start somewhere. As opposed to the other worst to best videos I've done on here, which mostly features a crop of albums that are only marginally separated by their relative quality, this list could only really begin with the Future Bites. For my money, the only album Steven has ever released under any name that just isn't good. If you're a longtime viewer of the show, you'll know that we actually reviewed this album when it came out in 2021, and we were all, shall we say, collectively nonplussed. Our feelings were only exacerbated as the year went on, and not only did the Future Bites narrowly make our worst albums of the year list, Personal Shopper nabbed the illustrious title as our least favorite song of 2021. That said, as difficult as this might be to believe, my feelings regarding this album are complicated? It hasn't grown on me, I'm sorry to say, both for my own sake and because I know there are a not insignificant amount of Wilson fans who have taken to this album, and believe me, I've never wanted to board the actually train more. The vast majority of fans received this about as well as you'd expect a bunch of curmudgeon-y prog fans to react to their golden boy releasing a new romantic-style pop album, which is a major bummer, frankly, because ideally, I think when artists have peripheral solo careers, this is exactly the sort of risk that you want them to end up taking. Something that never would have flown under the name of their primary act, but still ends up showcasing their versatility as a musician. I don't doubt that, in concept anyway, this could be pulled off. But my primary reaction to this record today is, okay, but not like that, though. The main issue here is the writing. Steven has been interested in humanity's connection to technology since the early Porcupine Tree and No Man days, and while his occasionally clunky stabs at this very specific subject aren't exactly what I would call nuanced, they were always rooted in human emotion. Fear of a Blank Planet is a great album, partially because of its heavy-handed concept being a perfect reflection of the adolescent main character's immaturity and myopic worldview. But what evens it out is that, there's an empathy on display. The Future Bites does have occasional moments of insight in songs like Man of the People or 12 Things I Forgot, the latter of which is easily the best thing on here by a considerable distance, but often these observations made about technology and humanity are couched in a snide, holier-than-thou tone that simply does not make for an interesting experience. Personal Shopper, Eminent Sleaze, and Count of Unease all have elements of their lyrical construction that just feel like the listener is being talked down to, and worse, being told a bunch of very pithy viewpoints on modernity that feel both blunt and shallow. So, okay, the lyrical side of things is mostly a wash, but Steven is one of our greatest living rock producers. Surely the musicality of this will add some support to the experience, right? If only. The problem here is not that Steven went pop. It's that he did a lackluster job of doing it. So much of the production on this album is as blunt as the lyrical content, often being employed in angular, stilted, cold, and ugly ways. It feels like Steven was trying to reach the halfway point between Kraftwerk and New Order, and stopped before adding any definition whatsoever. At the end of the day, this is an admirable pivot, but it feels its growing pains as it's apparent that Steven has never leaned away from his strengths as an artist more, and ends up creating something that, when you take into into account what the singles for the Harmony Codex sound like, we'll probably end up feeling very transitional and awkward. At a relatively scant 40 minutes, this is not an album that I would say is excruciating to sit through. It's just deeply unbalanced and wrong-headed. There is still a handful of decent moments, but I think I can comfortably say that this is only for Steven completionists. If you do find yourself curious, or similarly to me, found this quite disappointing, I do highly recommend that you check out the B-Sides EP released alongside this album, as I think that all the material on there is mostly better than what there is on the record proper. It doesn't solve my production quirks, but if this record ended up being only its strongest moments between the two of these releases, I would find it easier to play devil's advocate for. Okay, with the very bottom of the list out of the way, now we can venture forward with a bit more confidence and enthusiasm. After hinting at his sound potentially going in a poppier direction with select moments on Hand Cannot Erase, here he doubles down on that accessibility and effectively tries his hand at making a solo Peter Gabriel album in the vein of Us or So. It's a sound that Steven wears like a glove, striking a middle ground that was bound to still alienate his hardcore prog-loving audience, which it definitely did to some extent, but the general muscularity of the project as a whole certainly kept public opinion on this skewed towards being favorable. While I think a slimmer runtime would have definitely benefited this to match the snappier sound, that's really my most overriding complaint here, as the crop of songs we have contains some beautiful highlights. The title track is a fantastic opener with a slow, rhythmic build that ultimately crescendos into one of the album's most incredible moments. Both Nowhere Now and Same Asylum as Before showcase Steven's political musings in far more tasteful and cathartic incarnations, and Pariah, the album duet with vocalist Nanette Tayeb, is just straight up one of Steven's best songs. The colorful, bubbly synths, the razor-sharp guitars all across here, this all manages to have both a thick, digital-feeling atmosphere and a more analog, immediately satisfying punch when it's necessary. Refuge is another huge album standout to me that props up the first half of this as being some of the most consistently great music he's ever penned. The second half is ripe with great moments too. The dancier, piano-led Permeating is an immensely satisfying risk. People Who Eat Darkness feels like a particularly sinister piece of Rush worship, and the final 1-2 punch of Detonation and Song of the Unborn end the album as steadily as it began. Less substantial moments like Blank Tapes or the slightly too long Song of I make the experience feel just a little lopsided, but that's about the start and end of this album's issues. This record is definitely a bit more topical than usual, but it's written obliquely enough to not feel thuddingly annoying or insincere. Though I can't lie and say that I think that this doesn't limit what's going on here a little bit. It's all pulled off well, it doesn't come off as posturing or anything. But it does feel as though Steven hits a few of the same beats over and over again. Whereas with other records, whatever theme or concept he tackles never truly limits his scope. Still, if you ever had trouble getting into Wilson's music, or just need an easier in for whatever reason, if you're not quite as used to prog, I think that To the Bone is substantive enough to hook you without being alienating or indulgent, which even some of his best work can often be. We often talk about the phenomenon of the double album masterpiece on the podcast, a prospect that we all relish when it comes to some of our favorite artists. When a musician you love doubles down and decides to make a hugely ambitious, messy double record, sometimes it doesn't really matter how consistent it is. The idea of someone with immense talent just cutting loose and not conforming to any self-imposed rules or discipline can often yield some creative high points that you may not otherwise get. This is not something Steven is new to, granted, as we've covered Porcupine Tree's scatterbrained double album The Incident in the past, so the idea of him taking another crack at it is tantalizing when you consider that even as someone who totally wants to embrace the mess, I'm not super hot on The Incident as a whole. And here, thankfully, with Grace for Drowning, I think we get most of what I was looking for. It's a far more consistent and straight-laced affair, and often ventures further backward towards jazz fusion and even Brian Eno-style art rock than any of Porcupine Tree's proper stuff ever did, which means you get something new and something that isn't far away enough from Steven's strengths to truly risk faltering. This may be 83 minutes, but as such, it's a treasure trove of fantastic moments one after the the other. The album truly hits its stride on the twin pairing of Deformed to Form a Star and No Part of Me, two very heavily orchestrated tracks that start off rather plaintively and build into something way more dynamic and explosive. And the climax of the first half, Remainder the Black Dog, is Wilson at his most shameless when it comes to his King Crimson worship, which is about as beautiful and as chaotic as you'd imagine. Some of the guitar work here is honestly so out there that I'd be willing to call it avant-garde. There are less huge standout highlights on the second disc, save for the obvious standout of the closer, Like Dust I Have Cleared From My Eyes, a beautifully straightforward exhale of a song that may be one of the most beautiful things he's ever made, but what it trades for in less of those big moments, it gains in solid consistency and atmosphere. Nothing here is anything less than great, so why isn't this higher? Grace for Drowning is a tough nut to crack. Tonally, it's on the darker side, but coming after an album like Insurgence, that darkness feels a little bit less potent, as the synergy between the music and the themes isn't quite as strong here. Steven often gets accused of being way too indebted to his influences by his critics, a criticism that I often think stems from a very shallow read on his music in a holistic sense. But if you were lobbying that criticism at this record in particular, I think I might be inclined to agree with you. It feels as though the music itself is sort of railroaded into being what it is, if that makes sense. Though I still think the well that he draws from is diverse enough to sustain an album this large, for the most part. As a result of this relative imbalance between isolated components of the music, this was one of my least favorite Wilson projects when I first heard it. But now I think this has a litany of moments that are truly staggering, far more than something like The Incident had, so in my estimation, it's actually risen a fair bit over the years. Though I would be lying if I said that I didn't want it to be a little bit riskier, even if that lack of risk-taking is what makes this such a solid release. On the opposite side of things, when it comes to relative concision, just 2 years after Grace for Drowning, Steven took an effort to rein himself in to create the follow-up, 2013's The Raven That Refused to Sing, which is a 6-track, 55-minute-long affair that hones down the track list to nothing but the fabulous highs of the previous record and calls it a day. While we might not have Richard Barbieri, Gavin Harrison, or Colin Edwin alongside Steven, this is where it becomes very clear that the personnel other than Steven still matters a great deal when it comes to the overall project. Steven is a hugely talented multi-instrumentalist, but still employs a murderer's row of amazing musicians when he can't get his usual bandmates for a solo record. And the results are fantastic. Most notably with the hiring of virtuoso session guitarist the legendary Guthrie Govan, who brings a phenomenal sense of dynamism to the playing here that can often leave you breathless. There's no in-your-face shredding on these albums, but there is no shortage of fantastic subtle details hidden in every song, each of which functions as its own short story, as this is effectively an anthology of sorts. And just in case it wasn't enough that Steven himself is behind the boards as usual, he also managed to get legend Alan Parsons to assist with things here. So you can be damn certain that this isn't just compositionally dense and ambitious, it all sounds incredible. You start off with the aggro and groovy Luminol, a song that has a bass line that's planted itself into my brain and will likely never leave. And immediately afterwards, you get the soul-bearing, positively devastating Drive Home, which has a similarly depressing music video you should absolutely check out if you haven't seen it. From the 10-minute epic The Holy Drinker to the bright, sparkling resplendence of The Pin Drop immediately after, not only does this album bring the tunes, but it has tonal diversity and a flow that makes this feel so fantastically holistic. And all of that is before you get to the incredible 1-2 punch of the penultimate track and the closer, The Watchmaker and the title track, which are two of my absolute favorite Wilson solo cuts. The Watchmaker blends together a grand and compelling core narrative decorated by some of the most explosive and spellbinding prog of this decade, and the forlorn, aching beauty of the closer just make this an extraordinary finish to an already extraordinary record. I mean, for God's sakes, this is some of Wilson's most potently effective and emotional music. I'm in tears by the time this is over. If you're already a prog nerd, this is absolutely where you should start, as you'll hear enough familiarity to feel at home, but the raw skill, concision, and downright beauty of Wilson's singular execution will feel like a breath of fresh air. It's an amazing record that I have basically nothing bad to say about. So that begs the question, what could possibly be better? Hand Cannot Erase is widely considered to be Stephen's best solo work, and I can't really say that that status is unearned. Not only do we get what is, alongside Deadwing, his most conceptually well-realized and emotional album experience, but a palette of sounds that pushes the envelope for Stephen as well. This is, point blank, one of the best-sounding rock records of the decade, even ahead of Wilson's other 2010s work, as the digital soundscapes and weighty instrumentals have never been more satisfying or more enveloping. Be it straight-up synth-pop on the title track, classic progressive rock on stuff like the Titanic Ancestral, or straight-up balladry on the absolutely soul-rending Routine, this is one of the most diverse albums in his catalog, and it's at the expense of nothing. Alongside a fearless sonic direction that has both unity and diversity in equal measures, we get the portrait of a character based on the real life of Joyce Carol Vincent, a woman who cut all contact with the outside world and died in her apartment, her body only being discovered 3 years after she went missing. And the gradual degradation of her sanity and mindfulness as isolation slowly poisons her is a feat I would only trust to incredibly talented storytellers. But for Wilson, this almost feels like a softball that his whole oeuvre has been building to, as I find the conceptual slants of albums like Fear of a Blank Planet, Lightbulb Sun, and Deadwing all have a spiritual kinship with this, and will similarly break your heart in two if you get involved with these elements in a way that you did with those records. Not only did Stephen consciously step up his game for this, but collaborator Guthrie Govan did too, as this is some legitimate career best work from him all across, be it the more technically demanding and immediate stuff or the more intricate, borderline mathy stuff he gets up to on some of the bigger tracks here. It's all utterly outstanding. After a long and fantastic career with Porcupine Tree, I think artists like Stephen have more than earned their right to maybe rest on their laurels a little bit, but this album here is precisely why Stephen is one of my favorite artists of all time. He simply never stops pushing himself, and knows just how much to risk, and just how much to play close to the chest. Here, it's nothing but full marks. It's perfect, and frankly, I wouldn't blame anyone who thinks this is the best record Stephen has ever put his name on. And yet, my relative enjoyment of these top two albums is basically exactly the same. I could change my mind about this as soon as tomorrow, frankly, but right now I think I will narrowly herald Stephen's solo debut, Insurgence, as his best solo work. While Insurgence is a well-liked record, I don't think many people love this album the way that I do. And the vast majority of Wilson fans definitely wouldn't put this above things like Raven or even Grace for Drowning, so what exactly earns it my #1 spot? In a word, atmosphere. This is one of Stephen's most adventurous records across basically any of his projects, carrying over some of the more esoteric elements of records like Deadwing or The Incident, and fully realizing them on here in a way that feels far more unguarded and, frankly, reckless. And I appreciate this quality immensely. It's both satisfying to feel like he's fulfilling his creative potential, and it's nice to see him in a less fussy mode when it comes to album construction and sonic direction. And the end result is the spirit of a double album masterpiece contained within something that has enough structure to still not feel like it's all over the shop. Insurgence is a dark, very brooding record that often indulges in music that's less technical and more textural, making it a huge outlier in this discography. That doesn't mean that the more straightforward and immediate moments on here are gone, far from it. It just means that they get to stand out a little bit more amidst a sea of more ephemeral moments. Take the absolutely godly No Twilight Within the Courts of the Sun, which is about as close to the Mars Volta as Stephen would ever get. dialing up the eccentricity as far as possible into territory that feels downright alien, especially on this record. Seeing as this was his first solo effort, we do actually have Gavin Harrison on the drums here, and he's just as incendiary here as he is on the proper Porcupine Tree records. Opener Harmony Corrine basically sounds like a lost Porcupine Tree B-side, but it contains within it something noisier and grittier. Speaking of which, there are downright attempts at noise rock on here, calling back to some of the In Absentia demos, where it felt like Steven was somehow attempting to meld prog with sonic youth. Abandoner is basically a gloomy trip-hop song, salvaging balances plaintive, sparse, minimal beauty, and waves of pure noise. And several songs on here, like Significant Other, for example, elect to have passages that devolve into straight-up shoegaze on the chorus. It's not as well-balanced of an experience as the last two records, for sure, but it makes up for that in terms of diversity and pound-for-pound experimentalism, which feels refreshing, even now. In my eyes, this is Steven at his most daring and his most successful, and it creates a wholly captivating experience that's just so easy to sink into. It is a grower, for sure, but I think it's probably more of a well-rounded album than perhaps maybe my younger self and many other listeners gave it credit for. As it stands, this is still one of my favorite things Steven's ever made, and while I wouldn't say it's a good jumping off point, I can easily say it's one of his most rewarding and fascinating projects. It definitely doesn't have the very sincere emotional edge of the last two albums either, but again, this sort of single-minded darkness on here becomes its own brand of effectiveness, and it instills me with a feeling that honestly isn't as potent anywhere else on any of the music that Steven's ever made, save for maybe his dronier, noisier ambient stuff that he did with Bass Communion. But honestly, that's about it, and this is achieved with so much more dynamism and more control, and it just creates an incredible feeling while listening to it. That's going to be it for today, folks. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like or consider subscribing, and if you've got your own Steven Wilson opinions, leave them in the comments below and we can have a discussion, or an argument. Be sure to tune in to our main show where we review music and talk about music news every single week, and once the Harmony Codex drops, be on the lookout for us talking about that, as it's sure to make for a great discussion, and I personally can slot it into where I think it goes in the overall Steven Wilson canon of records. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Oreos, Milk's favorite cookie.